Yeah. Yes.
Bassem? Sorry. Just so I can keep the sentences kind of short. When I pause, you can then interpret, if that's okay. Okay. That's fine. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, now we can start. Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. Today we are going to look at asset-based finance and machinery equipment valuation. I have a speaker today who is none other than Gary Regan. He's an accomplished leader, consultant, and diversified specialist in equipment finance, leasing, and asset management. Gary was educated in Dublin and London, holding over 25 years of senior management experience working in global organizations across Europe and MEA regions. A true visionary and catalyst of GCC finance and leasing sector, with a driving ambition to oversee and lead regulatory changes in promoting potential opportunities across the industry and the region. Gary is the founder and managing director of Altalis Capital and Asset Flow Global, and a business partner with the Invigaz EMEA, part of the Alta Groups. From 2011, Gary has held several senior management positions within the equipment, leasing, and finance sector in the UAE, including head of corporate and financial institutions for Reed Brothers Auctioneers, head of vendor and distributor development at Car Please Emirates Limited in UAE, head of operating lease at Al Hali Oryx Finance, vice president and equipment finance at Abu Dhabi Finance, and senior asset-based finance at Adib. Gary has acted as a strategic advisor in the UAE Ministry of Finance and the IFC World Bank on the creation and implementation of leasing and secured transaction laws in the UAE. So here, over to you, Gary, for the presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruka. Thank you, Bassem, for supporting. Good afternoon, all. Very much a pleasure to present to you today to all the members of Wtaqeem. on what I believe is a very important issue for us as a group, specializing in asset financing valuation methodology. And what we're going to cover today is in particular, your role and how important your role is within asset-based financing, but also to give you a better picture of the risks, mitigants, and control process of the role and financing and the operational side of leasing companies, the process of valuation and recovery. So when leasing companies or financing companies look to finance or lease equipment, what are the key strategic steps and processes that we look for or that we engage in with a view to ensuring and mitigating our risk, and ensuring that our asset values, credit risk mitigants are maintained during the life cycle of leasing or asset financing. And in particular, in this case, we're talking about machinery financing and not invoice finance or any form of asset-based lending. We're specifically encompassing leasing and financing of heavy equipment. And I think, one of the key steps for us today is to look at your role, your role as valuers when it comes to assisting finance and leasing companies, where you fit into the general process of the expertise that you provide to leasing companies and asset finance companies, and potential opportunities that you can look at with a view to the process in particular of the valuation and the recovery. And I'll cover each step as we evolve through the presentation. Okay, so just to move on, as Ruka kindly mentioned, my background, I won't repeat the integral of where I've been and what I'm doing, but to give you a rough and a kind of a further evaluation, working and living in the Middle East over the last 15 years, as you can see, there's been a number of institutions and steps that I've taken through the process. When I came to the Middle East in 2011, my first role was with Ritchie Brothers Auctioneers. And by working with an auctioneering company coming from a European background of leasing, Ritchie Brothers, and the reason why I allude to Ritchie Brothers as an auctioneering company, it gave me the first understandings of the process of value. As an auction company, auctioneering and selling of secondhand equipment or used equipment or stressed equipment initiated my knowledge of, okay, when you're aligning sale of asset in this particular region, how does it align to financing methodology and how does it align to value in a recovery process? So once I kind of started from back to front, once I was with Ritchie's, I've then gone through the whole leasing process, financing process with a number of institutions. And as you will find during the course of this webinar, relating to my experience of what I've been doing has been very much encompassed about value, asset value, the reasons why asset valuations are so important, the stages of asset valuations, and as you look upon your own roles as valuers, where you see those values of assets and the values of different types of asset in particular, how they relate to an institution's credit and risk and even deal origination strategies. One of the things that I will allude to a little bit more during the course of this webinar will be regulation, financial regulation, and in particular, steps that have been taken in KSA and in the UAE most recently with a view to leasing and financing leasing regulation that protects both the lessor, lender, and the borrower. Regulation that provides for secured asset registries, where asset registries like Sigil, and as we have here, the Emirates Integrated Registries Company, that provide that safeguard and title and define that title of ownership of assets to lessors or lenders during the course of the term. Excuse me. And why that's so important, the registration of assets and the registries that have been set up under leasing laws and secured collateral lending laws, you know, to provide access to credit for SMEs, to provide additional, you know, foreign direct investment into countries to support, you know, industrialization, digitization. And these are steps that governments and ministries of finance in each jurisdiction have taken place, in particular in Saudi Arabia over the last 7 years. I've been actively watching the growth of the institutional environment, especially in your non-bank financing sector. If I recall, you know, 2000 maybe 13, 14, there was only maybe 4 or 5 non-bank finance companies. Now you have Yanal, you have Tamwil Alula, you have Ajil, you have, you know, the involvement of non-bank finance companies and leasing companies in Saudi has really evolved to create that greater opportunity on finance leasing and release of capital into the market. So we'll touch on aspects of that as we go through our presentation. Just to give you a rough down on the agenda, and thanks again to Ruka. I'm just going to mention and touch on asset flow, what we are, who we are as a company. We'll just run through some asset finance company structures, the operational structures. We'll look at the asset-based finance process from within a financial institution. You know, what role asset finance companies play in providing machinery and equipment and leasing finance to end users. We'll touch again, we'll go more deeply into the regulatory issues in asset financing and the role of law in particular to recovery and the valuation process. We'll take a look at, chat about the ABF and the leasing GCC landscape and the opportunity that exists and how the industry has evolved over the last, you know, I would say the last 10 years and where it's going in the next 10 years. And finally, we'll finish off with, you know, some points as your role as valuers in the asset financing process and where you can add significant value to, you know, the whole valuation process, both in recovery, both in origination, and both in asset disposal management, you know, all additional value-add services that we could look to provide you with, or support functions we can provide you with. So asset flow global, we've been working with the Ministry of Finance for the last 4 or 5 years on the Strategic Committee on Secure Transactions Lending and Lease Financing Regulations within the UAE Ministry of Finance and the World Bank. The reason for that is that, as I mentioned, we have had no leasing regulation in this region, in the UAE in particular. And like Saudi Arabia, we're beginning to catch up. You know, these laws that are being applied in this region add significant weight and value to the valuation process. By having law and by having laws that define recovery process. So in the event of default of any particular loans or any particular leases, the valuation of that asset in the event of default allows for the asset finance company or leasing company to repossess that asset. The importance of the value of that asset at default is crucial to the debt recovery process and the value and recovery process. What value is on the asset, how the value can be liquidated, where it can be liquidated, what's the timeline for liquidating it. And as Asset Flow as a company, we are engaged in each step of this ecosystem to support financial institutions, educate, knowledge build, teach them, encourage additional lending practices by trusting the laws that have now been implemented. By doing that, by having regulatory practices in place, we also are involved in FDI initiatives, foreign direct investments, to encourage new leasing companies to come to the UAE, promotes investment. It promotes the strategic initiatives of the government in, excuse me, industrialization, digitization, medical, green energy, sustainability, all types of asset classes that both the KSA and the UAE governments are trying to promote. Promoting of these types of asset classes and industries can only come with flexibility and with additional leasing and asset financing solutions that providers are comfortable with. So as a company, providing knowledge and capacity building initiatives to UAE banks and to KSA, I work with a number of KSA leasing companies on certain business introductions. Our job is to develop all aspects of asset-based lending and finance initiatives. As well as Asset Flow Global, we've just recently set up in the UAE's first finance leasing company, which is Alta Lease Capital. And currently we are awaiting the first license from the Ministry of Finance to be granted to us. We've waited for this for about 4 years now. So again, like KSA, you started with a number of small entities in the asset finance industry and companies 7 or 8 years ago, and now your market is flourishing. Various different providers in motor transport, various different asset classes, technology leasing companies, leasing companies serving SMEs, mortgages, housing, multiple of companies in KSA that have now evolved. We hope to, see that transition happen in this region as well over the next few years. So fingers crossed we can get our license and start doing what we do best. When we talk about regulatory and legal positioning, one of the biggest challenges in the region that affects valuation. Remember, during the course of this webinar, I'm trying to relate everything that we're talking about with a view to the importance of values and valuations in various different contexts of asset recovery in particular. When there's no leasing framework and no flexibility, and lenders or lessors have no ability to recover or to perfect security in asset finance deals, they're forced to go through a court litigation recovery process. And when you're forced to go through a court litigation recovery process without freedom of execution or repossession, I'm sure you're all aware that the longevity and the length of time it takes for court processes to transact themselves, asset values plummet. It could take a year, it could take a year and a half. And this is what we have seen in this region, that the inability to perfect security is a challenge for institutions to lend. Leading on then to the institutional environment, when there's the challenges on security to perfect and the historical legacy problems, banks and leasing companies, or in particular banks, when there's no leasing regulation, they have a limited credit appetite to do or to lend money against specific asset classes, unless the favorites for everybody in most jurisdictions is yellow plant, trucks, cranes, anything that has a registration plate or a serial number that can be repossessable and that can be sold in a secondary market. And I know that there's still challenges to doing that in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, but as we evolve our regulatory position, we hope that the freedom to execute without a mortgage over an asset, the freedom to recover in a fast-track system allows for a quicker execution and maintains value in assets a lot quicker and a lot sooner, that they can be sold through an auctioneering company. Banks are unable to own assets and they lend with a mortgage, whereas lessors can lease and lease with an ownership title. Most institutions are policy driven, lacking the knowledge and the operational efficiency when it comes to asset-based lending, the challenges that are accrued with a view to valuation, debt, recovery. I'm sure again most of you are affiliated with many institutions or work with them as part of your day-to-day roles. Credit policies and risk policies, banks and institutions don't diversify or they don't move outside of their existing policies and process, have selective appetite on asset classes, and don't deviate. And thus it puts pressure on other industries like medical, industrial, assets that don't have registration plates, power, energy, generators, compressors. The smaller asset that's required to industrialize and grow smaller SMEs and other manufacturing business in food and beverage, it's very difficult for them to actually put a value on these particular assets. That's why we as companies work very closely with the distributor. We work very closely with the manufacturers. So the institutional environment, and as I say, I know Saudi Arabia have progressed in the UAE. We don't have any alternative liquidity sources via our non-bank finance company channel. Many have stopped lending over the last 5 to 6 years due to various different challenges. As I mentioned, I worked with Al Hayat Oryx, which is formerly, it's now Yanal in KSA, Gulf Finance, and there was a Gulf Finance operation in KSA also, Abu Dhabi Finance. A number of challenges has prevented liquidity for companies to grow their asset books. One of the key processes due to regulatory issues in this region, and again, you allude to KSA also, the self-funding, a lot of where valuations are also applicable, a lot of manufacturers or say distributors, and I'm sure you will probably hear of many of those in Saudi at the moment, like Sani, Zoomlion, XCMG, some of the Chinese manufacturers who provide self-funding solutions to their end users or to their subcontractors for various projects on NEOM. When they provide they're forced to self-fund because they're not able to sometimes get that appetite from the finance and leasing companies. Again, that's a particular part of the industry that you may not be familiar with, is that many manufacturers will self-fund. They carry a huge amount of debt. Now, carrying a huge amount of debt, in the event of default, that valuation that they have on their book is very important to their liquidation of those assets over time. So as well as focusing on banks and financial institutions, you also have manufacturers or also industrial companies that may provide payment plans or PDC payment plans to companies looking for machinery for 12 months or 24 months. So with the manufacturer and end user, you'll also find very much a definitive need for valuations during the life cycle of their on-book financing programs. So our role in asset-based finance and leasing, we work with banks and finance companies on their secured movable management practice. We don't provide valuation solutions ourselves. We would subcontract that out to, Land Sterling or a few other companies I'm sure that you'd be familiar with. But what we do is we look at appraisal. We look at the valuation of equipment and we physically appraise it with a view to removing it, storing and disposing it, monetizing the security through auctioneering and liquidation methods by employing global auctioneering companies like Ritchie Brothers, like Euro Auctions, like ESDAD Auctions are actually a brand new company that have set up in Saudi Arabia only in the last 6 months. They're a South African auctioneering company, and I think it's worth taking note. It's ESDAD, EZDAD, ESDAD Auctioneers. They are now working very closely with a lot of agencies in KSA. And also we work with clients on debt management. By working on debt management, as we look at their debt, we look how we can work with institutions to liquidate their debt with a view to selling their assets and minimizing their overburden on borrowing. With distributors and manufacturers, I mentioned, we help them with their on-books finance. We help them with their credit and risk management processes. Again, manufacturers have surplus assets. We help them sell those assets into secondary markets, thus improving their operational efficiency. And we help them on lease financing advisory. As I mentioned, distributors are in a great position in the UAE at the moment. With the new finance leasing law, many of the major distributors like Famco and Volvo, and a few more of the family offices like Galadawi, are in a position to set up their own transparent finance leasing companies by becoming registered. And thus they themselves will be in a position to carry out the process in a more transparent fashion. So also we look at asset restructuring from again, from an insolvency perspective. Insolvency laws have been passed in KSA and also in the UAE, which allows for companies, to avail of restructuring and turnaround management solutions by working with professional services firms like Deloitte, Alvarez and Marshall. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of situations yourselves where part of the debt, or asset restructuring has been asset valuation process, where assets are being maybe managed by banks or managed by leasing companies that may be part of a merger or an acquisition, or they may be excess or surplus to the restructuring and turnaround management process. The question you would ask is well, when I'm providing an asset valuation, is it for an M&A, is it for secondary use, or is it for a disposal process? And when you're giving the valuation, well, do you know where that you could potentially support the disposal process, how you can give further advice on recovery practices, where are the best markets to sell and replace secondary equipment into different jurisdictions by way of global asset remarketing solutions. And that's what we do, and that's what we're trying to, bring to fruition across the region. And in general, we work with companies, surplus and excess stressed assets. We help them under finance their unused rental fleets, end of project fleets, and we help them upgrade aged fleet, used equipment where it could be 5, 6, 7 years old. We help them dispose, generate liquidity to be able to put down a deposit against new equipment. So very quickly, moving on to the topic of asset finance and leasing companies. I mean, how valuations, fit in the process, and it's the final sentence of the slide there. So you're all familiar with the board chairman, shareholders, and executive board sits at the top of any company. In a finance and leasing company, we'll have the chief executive officer and managing director. Now, within the ExCo team, we'll have chief commercial officer. They will look after sales, marketing, vendor management, and deal origination. A chief risk officer, the credit risk department, audit control, policy process, and enterprise risk. Chief financial officer, finance, accounts, treasury, borrowings, HR, P&L, budgeting. Chief operations officer, loan processing management, the lease management, default management, asset recovery, and asset disposal. And from a legal perspective, the chief legal officer looks after regulation, licensing, legal documentation, the governance, recovery management processes through the courts, and the company secretary. Now, within the internal structure of a leasing company, your role as valuers and our role as lessors or financiers, where we should look at valuation, but a lot of institutions don't, is at the initial origination stage. So a chief commercial officer role, when you're looking at a sales or you're looking at a deal from an origination channel, the origination channel could be direct from a customer or through a particular vendor. And I know with the likes of Zahid or many of the vendors that you have or distributors in the region, that's where you originate your deal. Now, again, in yellow plant and machinery, the vendor and the leasing company would have a significant relationship, and the historical data of value of that asset at the point of leasing it or financing it is driven by an invoice. But we all know that that's a very, very transparent market. And we know that the values of a Caterpillar 329 or a Komatsu PC 400 or whatever the asset is driven by the price that's set by the distributor. So we're from an origination stage from yellow plant and trucks, we're comfortable at that level. But when it comes to medical, when it comes to CNC machinery, when it comes to other assets, there should be, in my opinion, there should be a secondary need for a valuation or even a validation of that invoice by a valuation company to say, okay, that we're comfortable at the outset, that we're happy to finance this amount at this level for this period. And I believe you do fit in that process at loan origination timeline. The chief risk officer in the credit department, the risk department, you also fit into that practice as well, in the fact that, you know, when you're analyzing a risk from a financing perspective, well, instead of many institutions will look at the credit risk of the client, and it's a very, very common thing in this region. As leasing companies, we should look at both credit risk and asset risk. But of course, the legacy issues and legacy problems of old, it's very difficult to look at, excuse me, the recovery process when it's quite not perfected as yet through the court system. But ultimately, a credit department and a risk department should have valuation modeling in place for assets, that when they analyze a customer or analyze the credit quality of that customer, they also are analyzing the valuation of that asset during the life cycle of the deal, to be able to match the cash flows of the client's repayment capacity against the recovery or the value of that asset in a recovery process. Excuse me. And that creates the kind of synergy between both the risk and credit to say that they're comfortable in leasing or lending against an asset because, number one, we're comfortable with the credit and the client's credit history and strength of the customer. Number two, we're happy with the risk and control of that asset because we know that in the event of recovery or in the event of default, we can dispose of that asset or we can obtain a value on that asset, and we know we can sell it through a specific channel, and we can obtain a value that could minimize our debt or mitigate our loss. The chief financial officer's role in valuations, not as much, but in particular the chief operations officer. That's where probably your main activity would originate from, is on the instructions of the chief operations officer's teams within an operational process. And in the event of default of a particular client of a loan or a lease, the instruction will come to you to value that asset with a view to the default management of the financial institution, the process that they need to engage on, with a view to the asset recovery process that they need to act upon, and the asset disposal process that they need to conduct in order to recover the value in the event of that the asset is repossessed and sold. Now, it's how you engage with your valuation process in these particular three ways we'll allude to a little bit more. But, you know, it's very important for companies to understand those, or for leasing companies, finance companies to understand that we can trust the valuations that we've been given with a view to being able to try to maximize their recoveries at a disposal stage. Now, I know that's very, very difficult in this current environment. And this is what we're trying to work on, is that when you value something, you're looking at an asset in its current location. You're looking at it in an in situ environment. You're looking at its value to the customer there and then. But where we look at upon it from an asset management perspective is that, well, what type of asset is it? What year of manufacture is it? How old is it? And what secondary market does it have if we were to extract that machine from its existing location and sell through an OLV, an orderly liquidated value process? These are the biggest core practices within the valuation recovery process. But you do have a role. Your role fits valuations roles fits in 3 to 4 of these stages. And lastly, from a legal perspective, of course, you know, your legal stamping of a valuation document to say that it's worth X in a particular situation. You know, it's aligned to the disposal and sale process also. But it's for me, many institutions don't align themselves to credit and asset risk well enough. I think it's something that we as asset managers or valuers need to start educating in-house finance teams on the role of valuation, from origination right down to deal execution, right down to the lease management, right to the very, very end. I think it's very important that they understand value, that they understand their asset. Remember, we're asset financiers. We're not financiers, we're asset financiers. So that just gives you the brief structure of in-house management. The process, you know, the questions we ask on deal flow and how the process evolves within a finance institution is, well, the key point of an origination. So we talk about origination. Where is the deal coming from? Where the financing request come from? Is it coming from a client, or is it coming from a vendor partner? Is it coming from a client directly? Have they bought the machine? Is it on a sale and lease back? If it's a sale and lease back, what value have they paid for the machine to this point? Where did the machine come from? Was it imported? If it's a vendor partner, it's fine. It's aligned to new machinery, equipment that's known in the market. So these are questions that you originate from an origination perspective, that the more where the deal originates from, you will have more questions to ask. What's the asset class in question? The asset class will determine its value. What is the nature of the asset? Is it wheeled? Is it non-wheeled? New or used? The step that we would look at that on the first point I mentioned was the origination strategy, is what we call market risk. So the market risk of where the origination of the asset comes from. The asset risk relevant to wheeled, non-wheeled, new or used, that's your key step from a valuation process, because that sets out the the process for the remaining steps. Wheeled or non-wheeled, we're comfortable with. We know, you know, that there's a valuation, you know, and you can see that, strength of the asset class and the value. Is it used? If it's non-wheeled and used, again, many institutions are reluctant to lease or loan against used equipment. But when there's a valuation required at origination stage, you're asked to step in, you're asked to provide a valuation on certain assets that could fall under a sale and leaseback product. It could be a Marhaba product, it could be an Ijara product, it could be whatever, but you're looking at it on the context of where the asset came from. Is it new or is it used? Because the value you will give on it then will determine its life cycle value during the course of the leasing arrangements. The client risk encompasses the background to the client themselves, who they are, what they do, how they do it, the length of business, and the purpose of their business. We will assess clients from both two formats: their background and their client strength. The strength of the client, when you understand what they do and how they do it, that gives you a feel. When you visit a client, you get to understand the nature of the assets they have, how they use them, what they use them for, what cash flows they generate from the assets. Do they manufacture and sell? Do they rent? How are they using the equipment? So it tells you a lot about their background when you actually visit a customer or a client and see how they're using the equipment that they want to finance. What determines then, that's the asset and the client risk side, what determines the strength of the client is their financials. And the gathering of the financials, the bank statements, payables, receivables, what the company basically transact within a given 12 months or historical 12 months, their KYC, which is know your customer, who they are, who are the directors, who are the shareholders, is there a parent company. This gives you then the ability to assess the credit history and to look at your credit and default risk. When they look at a product, again, is it a loan, marhaba, ijara, sale and leaseback? The product kind of determines the regulatory and recovery risk. So how, if my asset is under ijara, under a leasing concept, well, what are the steps that my evaluation will be given to the leasing company or the asset finance company? What are the steps to be taken by the institution, or what we need to do to recover that asset, and how can I recover it? And during the course of a financing deal, so to speak, during the loan lease management life cycle, we continuously should be assessing the performance of the client and the performance of the asset during the lease and loan term. Now, I know many institutions don't do that, but for me, asset valuations should take place every 12 months. Every 12 months, there should be an indicative asset value to mitigate or to manage against exposure risks, to know exactly where valuations are an important part of the life cycle of a deal. I don't think it's right, personally, or my recommendation would be that, you know, to encourage a greater oversight of portfolio management, that leasing companies conduct valuations on a yearly basis. Yes, it's expensive for them, but it can also protect them in the event of being able to foresee their risk and manage their risk profiles in a far, far greater structure. Because what you need to find is like an XY axis where values of machinery go below exposure levels, or sorry, value of machinery increase above exposure levels. You know then that in the event of default, your asset value or your disposal route is covered or should be covered, and your losses are mitigated. That's a recommendation I would like to think that we could take forward from this particular session. So the role of asset finance companies, and you know, their role as alternative lenders and lead lessors in the case of what we do and how we do it, the importance of providing additional collateral and additional sources of liquidity into the market gives greater access to capital for SMEs and corporates, and they're able to protect their bank lines of credit. So the more leasing companies and non-bank finance companies that are involved in alternative funding sources, you know, the greater it is for an economic growth. We as valuers and also as equipment financiers, you know, we're generally seen as experts in the fields of financing and valuations. For me, you know, being an asset financier, you must be ingrained in assets. You must know, you should need to know the end-to-end process of asset financing and leasing, right down to disposal and recovery. And that's why I mentioned at the outset, when I mentioned my own background, I joined Ritchie Brothers Auctioneers first. I didn't go into a financial institution first when I came to the UAE. I joined Ritchie's first. That was the eye-opener. You know, that was the first, my understanding of value and methods of disposal and recovery. One of the things why I worked towards setting up asset flow in the last couple of years was that certain companies in asset disposal are very accustomed to what they do best in just generalized auctions, you know, selling equipment to the highest bidder, yellow plant and machinery. But in strategic sales processes, when customers are really trying to, or banks are trying to recover value in difficult assets, where we engage with valuers like yourselves, to say, well, look, we have medical equipment, we have CNC machinery, we have warehousing equipment, we have steel plants, we have, you know, a lot of the challenging assets that we have. There is a need for strategic disposal solution partners in the region. And I know in the UAE, we don't have any. That's why we set up. In KSA, I can only mention ESDAT again, because I know they've recently set up. But you're looking, when you're talking about disposal and working closely with valuation companies and leasing companies, as disposal companies, there's got to be that strategic step to finding values in secondary markets for difficult and hard to recover or hard to sell assets. So just going back to that, then as alternative lenders and lessors, you know, every country has strategic initiatives in key sectors. KSA and UAE are exactly the same, where there's a huge focus on industrialization, sustainability financing, green energy, mobility, and digitization. You know, as leasing companies working closely in these spaces with the likes of ABB in sustainability, you know, mobility companies, digitization, Cisco, Oracle, and across industrialization too, you've Johnson Controls. A lot of these major vendors are looking for strategic initiatives by way of leasing and financing to support their strategies. So you can see the added value of where greater emphasis in these key sectors should add more value to a valuation process and a leasing process. You know, lessors are aligned to vendors and OEMs, as I just mentioned. You know, we act as partners to provide what's called captive financing solutions to their product resellers. You know, lessors are secured by the asset, not just the credit and the financial capability of the company, where we manage the asset value and we depreciate it over time on par with what we see residual value concepts of the asset in line with standard accounting practices. You know, lessors are supposed to know the process, understand the value and recovery process, know kind of when to sell, where to sell, and how to sell equipment. And that's what I alluded to about specialized auctioneering companies working in tandem and very closely with valuation companies. I think there's a huge gap in the region, and I think that's something that needs to grow over the next 5 years. And as I said, you know, lessors maintain global relationships with OEMs and auction companies. And that's, you know, it goes without saying that risk is managed through relationships. So moving on from institutional environment, I touched upon, you know, and I'm not going to go through this in very full detail, but the impact of regulatory changes in KSA and UAE with the introduction of the asset registries and the unified registry in Saudi, and the introduction of the Emirates Integrated Registries Company, the MCR in the UAE, both are intended to provide enhanced operational efficiencies on secured movable financing in the region. The two laws that I mentioned to you there, the secured movables law in the UAE and the UAE finance lease law, both have been adapted in the last 4 years. But I know in Saudi, you have these laws in place for, you know, 5 or 6 years now, and both operate on the same principle. So by having unified registries of where title and secured title of assets that are leased or lent against is an important step for lending companies and leasing companies to know that they've got that title. Once you have that title, you can put a value against it. And that's the importance of having regulatory positioning that defines the title in recovery process. So as institutions, when we look at, you know, a self-assessment of how we're actually operating, you know, the questions we ask ourselves, well, Have we the operational efficiency? Do we understand the end-to-end process of asset financing? The knowledge and awareness of equipment, origination strategies, disposition strategies. How do we liquidate assets? What are the risk mitigants when it comes to asset financing? If the client needs to be remediated under certain insolvency laws we mentioned, if the client needs to be remediated and they need 12 months to be remediated under a bankruptcy process, how do we protect our assets during that 12-month long period where you may have given a valuation at day one, but we may have to give a moratorium to the client for 12 months while they go through the restructuring and turnaround process? You know, so your value from day one versus your value in day 365 is a very important step. You know, when we look at our lending and credit processes, how do we incorporate not just lending and credit, but how do we, you know, manage and mitigate risk better by not just lending, but by leasing, by incorporating value asset management processes into our credit processes that support each step of the asset life cycle. And I mentioned obtain asset values. Many people don't know. A lot of companies in the region don't know how to obtain value, beg your pardon, don't know how to obtain valuations in assets. They don't know why they need to do it. They don't know when they need to do it. And that's just end users or corporates themselves. But many in-house, in finance companies, if you ask them the top 4 or 5 valuation companies in the region, they wouldn't be able to give you the names. And this is, you know, part of the education and knowledge building that we need to grow. I touched upon sales methods, auctioneering processes, how, you know, our equipment can be sold through a private treaty sale, which is a time-sensitive auction process, an unreserved sale, which is to the highest bidder, or to a reserve sale. And if an institution wants to achieve your value that you've given them, you've given a value of $1 million reals against an asset, they say, okay, we think it's worth $1 million. How do we achieve that 1 million? Well, by doing that, you put it into a private treaty sales process or a reserved auction process where you allow the bidding process to try to achieve that 1 million dirham or 1 million real. Different services for different processes. Specialized assets. You know, when it comes to specialized assets, especially in industrial manufacturing, CNC, as I mentioned before, very, very specialized. There's very, very difficult to put a resale residual value on assets of that nature. But again, when you're looking at the expertise that's needed for yourselves, you know, when you look at, well, I need to give it a valuation, but on what grounds am I giving it the valuation? Where can I see historic data of similar type of assets that have been sold globally? There's a lot of auction companies around the world, in the US, in Europe, but it's very, who will sell a lot of used second-hand equipment in various different asset classes, but it's very, very difficult for you to be able to obtain historical data on used pricing, especially in the non-wheeled sector. And that's something that we're trying to develop in this region, is kind of a data point in being able to give you historical data on used equipment value. And now this will only happen over time, but it's something we want to be able to build and grow within our valuation process, you know, to try and make it I won't say make it transparent. It is transparent, of course, but to put the sales and disposal of equipment and align it with valuation and the expectation. When I mean it's the expectation of the lender or the lessor when it comes to having to sell an asset. If they think it's worth X, you say it's worth Y. Well, the market decides it's worth Z. That's the gap that we need to fill, and you need to be able to look at providing these data points. So hopefully over the next couple of years, we're going to try and establish within asset flow a a process of building a creative database on secondary market values and curve timelines. So that just gives you an idea of regulatory changes. When regulatory changes happen, institutions must adapt. And they're the questions that they must ask themselves. Well, if we're going to adapt regulatory change, we need to change our in-house process, and we need to change our in-house structures on how we actually carry out our business. So in the valuation of the assets process, when we look at the recovery, the recourse, and the asset sale, you know, can I recover legally, and under what grounds can I recover? Carrying out a valuation on an asset in the event of a client default provides the lessor or lender with a number, but what does that actually really mean? So as you're the experts in the process, I'm sure you've seen this in your day-to-day role. What I would describe as easy to finance, easy to value, and easier to repossess and dispose. Construction, trucks, passenger equipment, lifting equipment, forklifts, mobile cranes, road making equipment, mining, generating power and energy. I think that's the day-to-day asset class of choice for any leasing company and any asset-based financing company, machinery and equipment. That, you know, it's tangible, it's resellable, it's got a value, it's got registration. There is historic data available on this particular segment that, you know, Ritchie Brothers auctioneers and Euro auctions have. You're able to log on to Ritchie Brothers website, put in a make, model, year, manufacturer, serial number, not a serial number, but a manufacturing date of a particular machine, and it will give you the historical data over the last 10, 12 years of sales values. That helps you prove your valuation process and how the market determines the sale price. When you're looking at the harder to finance, harder to value, and harder to repossess and dispose, you know, as a leasing company, you know, these are types of asset classes that you kind of scratch your head when you get these requests, because you know, and I know that they're challenging, and you need to be, you know, very, very concise, very, very aware of your customer when it comes to CNC manufacturing, you know, steel plants, medical equipment, F&B, sustainable assets. While very much talk of future opportunity and growth is untested, you know, nobody can put their hands on the residual value of a Tesla at the moment. You know, if you're financing a Tesla tomorrow, well, prove to me the secondhand value of, you know, the event of repossession of a Tesla, what it's worth in 4 or 5 years' time. Is there historical data on Teslas locally or any EV in this region for that basis? You know, EVs, but also EV infrastructure, chargers, remote technology for overhead charging of buses, all of these types of sustainable assets, while ideal for future growth and sustainable projects, very difficult to put valuations on climate change asset classes in agri, in, you know, food, manufacturing, water, waste management, and it's something that we need to educate ourselves on over the next number of years as the market evolves. Technology, audiovisual and robotics, you know, they're very type of a strategic asset class that, unless you're dealing with specific vendors who are giving you potential recourse or who introducing you to top tier clients, you know, I alluded to Oracle, Cisco, Huawei, you know, technology, superb to work with these particular vendors, but in providing enterprise or cloud-based solutions, you know, 2 or 3 year leasing terms and technology, I know it's not very common with certain leasing companies in KSA, but in the UAE, it's beginning to grow. recovery of technology and putting residual risk on technology assets, it's very, very difficult. You've got to be very, very careful and understand that, audiovisual also, and robotics. We get a lot of inquiries for robotic equipment at the moment, for the likes of RMX, THL for parcel delivery, door to door, and things like that. Very, very difficult. So when you're looking at a valuation, you're saying to yourself, well, what's the purpose of my valuation? When I'm being asked, are you being asked by a leasing company or finance company when it comes to their equipment? Am I giving a valuation in situ, where the machinery is, as is, where is, ex situ, outside of its existing location, if it needs to be moved and put into storage, what is the value and how am I basing my valuation on in situ and ex situ values? Is it to be liquidated? An in situ value has a value to the company that's operating that equipment, that's generating cash flows, excuse me, to run their business. But the same equipment in an OLV, in a liquidated value perspective, the valuation could be less, 30-40%, if the machines were having to be sold in a stress situation. Is your valuation purely for balance sheet purposes under request of an end user or a company, which is, I'm sure, day-to-day work that you currently do? And again, similar to an OLV situation, is the asset stressed? Excuse me. Is the asset stressed and is it in need of disposal? And if you're carrying out a valuation in that perspective, well, can you add further value to the institution by saying, look, we're giving you a value. It's based on our, a stress situation or an OLV value, but we think by selling it and engaging with an auctioneering company, there's the potential to achieve a lot more. We're giving you the valuation that you need today purely to satisfy probably the service, but you may not know how an auctioneering company could achieve maybe 10 or 15 or 20% more on a value without engaging with them. And that's something that, by working closely with auctioneering companies, helps you give more accurate valuations, helps you provide additional value add services to your customers to say, well, I can give you a value, but I also believe I can help you dispose of it. I can help you with a valuation, through a disposition channel if needed. So, if it's in a stress case where a lesser lender must dispose of a difficult asset class, the valuation, in my opinion, needs to be conducted in a way where secondary market resale values can be realized. Auction companies can be of significant added value and research and support to yourselves, as well as your customers and as well as financial institutions. We as financial institutions would certainly rely on the support of valuers 100%, but also, excuse me, being able to support, being able to support the disposal side of the asset as well. Really what we want is to eliminate the pain point, and it's an end-to-end ecosystem that we're all involved in. So that's the legal. Just a final point on that, the legal side of it, the legalities. We all have the registries in place. And I would admit, I'm familiar with the Sajil registry and the registries in KSA, but I haven't had the experience of practicing of the recovery side of execution of an asset within KSA. So forgive me on that. But, everything depends on the legal approach to valuation, recovery, and dispose. If the legal system in Saudi is working in the manner of which the registries were set up to do, the perfection of assets that need to be recovered or valued, the sale of those assets in an expedient manner and the fastest manner possible. You know, is the legal system working with you and working with the leasing companies to ensure that everything is working in tandem? Or as I said, there's a flow, the recovery, title, grant of security, valuation of security, execution of security, and sale of security. You know, these are the steps that only the legal process evolving in the region, you know, that when a claim is made by an institution on their security, you're asked to value it at that time. Now, the process that evolves from there in the lender getting title and control of the security, is it a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, or 5 months? You know, is it a full company liquidation where you're involved in a full valuation of the company and not just strategic assets? So the question of can I recover legally versus, you know, can I recover legally and effectively are kind of two different things in a way. But it's a similar in UAE. It's a similar here in the fact that while we have our secured collateral registry, our institutions and our banking environment, they know it exists. But if a company, and this is the challenge we have, if a company is stressed and they're defaulting on their loans, they may have defaulted on their property loan or their industrial mortgage loan, but yet they have other facilities, and they defaulted on their asset financing facility. Under the asset financing facility, the institution can claim recourse on those assets through the title they have on the registry by following a specific pathway, which is a 15-day grant of recovery through Dubai courts, without having to go full legal or judicial. But that's costly in the eyes of the institution. But what the banks are doing is still, unfortunately, is that they're creating one full court case, and they're presenting the full court case against the client for all their facilities, which in terms is incorrect. You know, it's not giving the customer or the debtor the opportunity to release or manage or recover their debt by following the pathways that have been given. So there's a lot of educational knowledge building sessions that we need to do to try to evolve the recovery process and the valuation process that's part of each step of litigation process. So gradually moving on to more of a generic kind of a comment, just the slides on the growth and the opportunity in the region. You know, what we've been doing, I think what the Saudi and UAE have done, and Egypt in particular, we've adopted international standards on regulation and the implementation of effective laws that protect lenders, lessors, borrowers, and lessees. So within the, you know, kind of GCC environment, and including Egypt, you know, the KSA in Egypt have a very, very strong finance and leasing and asset-based financing environment. Egypt in particular, with over 24, I think to 25 leasing companies, in a very, very, you know, strong, I'd say strong economy, but certainly, you know, an excellent presence in leasing. And Saudi, as we know, have become very, very prominent in the leasing industry in the last 7 to 10 years. UAE, we're getting there very, very slowly but surely. And each of those three countries have adopted the secured collateral law, finance and leasing law, the factoring, and receivables law, and also the bankruptcy and insolvency laws that have kind of ring-fenced, that have provided this additional security and safeguarded lenders and lessors in the event of default. I've just commented there, the effective regulation adds value to your valuation process In the event of default, institutions must be in a position to recover their debt through effective asset recovery and disposition processes. They're very much key steps that make your valuation role very, very important. Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait, I understand that secured movables and collateral laws are currently in process. So you can see how the growth and opportunity in the GCC region, it's slow, but it's certainly getting there. And each country in their own right is kind of catching up on the other, and adapting international standards as they grow. As regards for market size, it's very difficult to get the market size, the total available market of leasing. But I mean, in the UAE and Saudi, we're hoping to try to come up with a situation where we can obtain some statistics. But certainly, as Saudi grows with the economic vision, and the UAE also 2030, that there's so much happening, we would hope to see a lot more activity, and leasing companies and new ways of leasing, lease to own models, finance leasing, operating lease. All of these products become more prominent as time evolves. So, your role as valuers, in engaging with external providers, and financial institutions, again, it's how you integrate with the disposition, how your valuations provide such key metrics when it comes to asset sales, plant closures, operational, financial issues, single item sales and multi-asset sales, recovery, private treaty sales, the evaluation and appraisal process. When we talk about appraisal, there's many times people would have asked me before, like putting two machines side by side and not being able to tell the difference in value between one or the other, yet both would have been the same year of manufacture, but certain key components of each machine may have been damaged, whereas you would recognize it, by a prominent carrying out an effective appraisal of that machine, the difference being potentially maybe $10,000 or $15,000 of value that may not be accounted for. And that's the importance of effective appraisal process. Excuse me. Other areas when you're being assessed for values is to, consider the key words, is a surplus, stressed, finance, to be liquidated, is it in a project, is it an equity release project, what type of asset class is it? Maybe, engaging externally, what other value add could you add from within your own companies, operational support, engaging with auction companies, site management, marketing, site clearance, you all know individuals that could support or companies that could support financiers to secure their assets. And there's the key steps, as I mentioned, we've been able to grow, the partners, service providers in Saudi with a view to the more affiliated channels for industrial assets and machinery and inventory that can be valued with a view to supporting disposal processes is, it's very much supported, So one thing about, when we talk about corporate recovery solutions, what I allude to is the value of the valuer, the additional benefits for disposition or asset liquidation, is engaging with the expertise of secondary market companies, where you can advise on strategies to suit clients' needs. You're able to provide the appraisal and valuations as trusted partners on various different strategies. You understand that, the world is a very, very big place. Assets that are used in Saudi Arabia or the UAE or anywhere in the GCC, what's called, we have the circular economy where in order to support green energy initiatives, the disposition and sale and value of assets can be relocated into secondary markets in Africa where there's a demand. How you can support your sustainability practices by helping your customers and your clients engage on secondary market values, routes to market for secondary market for secondhand equipment, and also being credible and being valued in what you do, from learning from experience and understanding companies who are capable of carrying out the services for you or for your customers or for financial institutions on a worldwide basis. And I'll happily share some details with Ruka, when we're finished, that if ever you're in need of support, or your customers are looking for support for steel manufacturing plants or oil lubricant plant disposals or decommissioning projects, we have a panel of companies that can help support the valuation process by adding disposal processes as well. And they've been only too happy to come to Saudi, to support you. And I'd happily share a list of those companies with Ruka at the end of this session to help you. So I was conscious of allowing some time for some questions, and I appreciate your engagement. And hopefully you found that very, very insightful. I know there was a couple more minutes I could have kept going, but I think my throat is getting a bit husky. But if you have any questions, Bassem or the team, if there's anything there that you'd like to share with me on questions, I'd happily take a few questions from you.
Thank you very much, Gary, for the presentation. Those with questions, you can put them on Q&A so that we can read them and respond to them. I've got one here. It says, what is the African auction company? Must be auctioneer company just started in KSA.
Yeah, I'm just going to see if I can. It's EZDAD, EZDAD auctioneers. EZDAD is the South African name, and sorry, beg your pardon. EZDAD is the KSA name, and WH auctioneers is the South African name. So I'm just seeing if I can type a note in here myself. Hopefully that answers the question. It's EZDAD auctions in Saudi Arabia and WH auctions in South Africa. Yeah, it's EZDAD. I'll just check it here. I just posted it into the webinar chat if anybody wishes to take a look.
My apologies, I'd lost the network. I'm back. Do we still have any questions? Any questions? Do we still have any questions? Yes, the name of the company has been put on the website. I hope Mr. Ali have seen the question, the response of the company that has started, the auctioneer company that has started in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Any questions? Maybe I can ask a question. Just in brief, what are the expectations in terms of valuation? What do you expect from the evaluation when someone is as a asset-based financer?
Yeah.
When you request for evaluation, what are the requirements? What are your expectations?
Yeah, we would like to see, 3 or 4 certain values that determine the outcome of that particular asset in the event of the scenario that it's in. If it's for just a valuation for management in-house on its current market value, fine. But let's assume that it's in a stressed case. Let's, because most importantly, the role of valuations is very important at the stressed environment. So when you look at in situ value, et situ value, and OLV value, is making sure what, as an institution, what's my best case, middle case, and worst case scenario, that if my exposure is a certain level, and if I'm owed 1 million real, how close am I to getting that 1 million real back if I have to go through, if I sell the equipment in situ? So if the business is sold and the equipment remains in situ, it's got a higher potential value. If we've got to take it out, if somebody else comes in to lease the warehouse, what's my value on moving it to a warehouse and storing it and then trying to sell it? Or it's in the same situation as an OLV value, it's liquidated. And being able to say, well, look, best, middle, worst. At least then you can factor in your provision. As valuers, you've given us that broad spectrum. You haven't just said your equipment is worth 1 million real. You say, well, look, we're going to be straight. We're going to tell you exactly how we see it. We've spoken to various different people in the industry. We think it can be sold this particular way, but if it's not sold this particular way, we believe that the only way we're happy, because we're covering our risk, we're covering our audit controls, we're covering our risk processes. We've done everything we can. So I think an evaluation report that is not 40 pages long, but is 2 pages long, but tells us how we can recover,
Okay. Another question. We are just expecting maybe people can bring in questions. A method of disposal, is it something that you need from us to advise you? Different machines, they have got different ways of disposing them. Some they can be sold very fast, they can move very fast. Others, they take time. Is that something that you want from us?
No, no, it's something that you as valuers, that exists. What I'm trying to say to you is that you can add value to your customers or your service partners or wherever you're doing valuations for. As I mentioned in the deck, the easy equipment to dispose of, they move fast, they sell well. It's when you don't know how a piece of equipment can be sold. What I'm trying to do is allude to the partners that are available to you, that if you need help, there is companies there that out there that can help you. And if it means just dropping an email to me saying, Jerry, we have you know, X, Y, and Z of assets located in Saudi. How can we help our customers dispose? I'm happy to give you, you know, that information and connect you with contacts that can help you. So it's the difficult assets. I'm not saying that I can, you don't need to do anything other than seek help. If you want help your customers, we're here to help.
Okay, that's fine. And I've got a question again from Ali. What is your advice to new valuers to gain experience? I think maybe experience in dealing with the equipment, financing and leasing.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. In fairness, you know, Ali, there's so many different asset classes. I think start with the basics, you know, get a handle of that's how I started. You know, I didn't have when I joined Ritchie Brothers, I had no idea of values. Well, I had a little bit of an idea, but it took me a year, 2 years to kind of understand all the familiarity. So what I would suggest is get familiar with kind of the easier asset class, with a view to, you know, yellow plant machinery and trucks and cranes, because, you know, the data that's available on that side will help you with your valuations. Once you know what a 6x4 is, or a 4x2 is, or, you know, a 320D or a 336, when you get more and more and more and see more of those machines, you get familiar with them on a day-to-day basis, so you understand, and then there's data. While you're doing that at the same time, you know, choose industrial machinery as one additional one, the harder one, and just research. All you can do is research, speak to providers who are selling the equipment, talk to them about the equipment. You know, the more you talk, the more you research, and the more you do listen to your colleagues as well and ask questions, it'll gradually come to you. But that's what I would say is gradually focus in wheeled assets, and then look at difficult assets as time goes on.
Okay, I know most equipment financiers, they come up with a register of valuers that they deal with.
Yeah.
What are the requirements, especially when you are selecting valuers? Do you just pick, or you have your due diligence that you do?
Well, as you know, you've worked with many valuers yourself, Ruka. You know, in this region, there's always a panel, and the banks work with panels, right?
Yes.
Now there's you know, we can only work within the panels that are reputable and that are provided to us, you know, and we trust the relationships that we've built up with, you know, Lance Sterling and Value Strat and, you know, Cavendish Maxwell over the years. You know, but evaluation provides a trail of historic trail. It provides an informative number that, okay, is part of process and policy. The biggest question always falls at the very end of the spectrum of the food chain, that if you're getting a valuation for a disposal of asset, well, how are you going to manage that at the end of the term? You know, how are you going to dispose, and where are you going to dispose it? So to answer your question is yes, we'll still use the panel valuers, but, you know, I would always encourage others to feel out the market themselves, talk to manufacturers, talk to distributors. You know, you'll get a better, sometimes can get a better feeling from the market than from a valuation sometimes, but the valuation is very important from a process perspective. You know, somebody could tell you in the market tomorrow, you know, I've got this X piece of machinery that we have on finance. I've received a valuation on it, but I have no idea, you know, where can I sell it in the secondary market? And, you know, you might get good advice, you might get bad advice. You know, it's what, as long as you seek the advice, that's the main thing.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question from Simpiwe. It says, how do you best justify evaluation done by an auctioneers and valuers? Is it possible that valuers will always be disadvantaged when it comes to recovered value? if they are both doing evaluation for disposal purpose.
Just if we can just repeat the first part of this, the question again, Ruka, please.
How do you best justify evaluation done by auctioneers and valuers? He's saying there's evaluation that is done by one done by an auctioneer and another one by a valuer. And he's saying, is it possible that valuers will always be disadvantaged when it comes to recovered value?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And again, a very good question. You know, an auction company's role is to support the disposal of the asset to achieve its maximum value in a secondary market. That's their skill. That's what they sell as a service, right? Auctioneers will look at certain asset classes and put their own, they're not effectively valuation companies, but they will put their own valuation on an asset based on historical data.
Mm-hmm.
But their job is to sell and do what they do into a secondary market. So I don't think that they're being devalued. I think that there's a synergy between them both, because ultimately the valuation that you would give your finance company will be X, and you've built that data also on historical value in certain asset classes. If it does end up in an auction company, you're both working in tandem together. The auction company's job is to sell that asset and obtain its maximum value. You've informed your customer that this is the best position you should be taking and how to sell it. When it comes to more difficult assets, you know, auctioneers will find it very difficult also to put a number, a valuation, so they will trust your valuation. You know, so when it comes to CNC machinery or other types of asset classes where they may have experience in just selling it and have some data, they will rely on your valuation to support their secondary markets, because when they go to customers, they may need to get independent advice from yourselves as valuers to say, look, we haven't sold some of this equipment in this region before. You know, we've been asked by a customer to sell lathes, CNC, punch press. We don't know. What is your opinion? So somebody could come to one of the members and team here, valuers, and seek there. So there's a definite synergy between both parties, you know.
Okay, thank you so much. I have another question from Ali. You mentioned that you started with auctioneer company first. What are the benefits will valuer gain by going or working with an auctioneer companies?
Yeah, the value you get is that you see real-time pricing of equipment there and then. So during an auction process, over a week, you could have 1,400 or 1,500 pieces of machinery that crosses the auction in a given point in time. And when you're watching that happen and you're involved in it, you're helping your customers achieve that value, but you're learning the value. So if you did an auction in October and you watched it happen, you see the values, and you're looking at a Cat D8 dozer, or you're looking at a D10, the brands become familiar. The models become familiar. You see a Cat D10 or D9 crossing the ramp today, $500,000. You see another one in 3 months' time at the next sale doing exactly the same thing. The next sale, you're going to be expecting the same price for this particular piece of machine. And if it doesn't reach 500,000, it might reach 4. But the thing is, you remember it. So the value from working in an auctioneering company tells you, you know, I was in Ritchie's for 4 years, and I built up a bank of knowledge that a 12 to 14-year-old Scania truck, Iveco, Renault, 6x4, 4x2, with 1,000 kilometers, with nearly 1 million kilometers on the clock, will still sell for $15,000 or $20,000, right? So you know when you finance something like that, if you want to finance a truck, and you know that 12 years later, it's still worth, 50,000 real in a secondary market. Well, if you finance it from year 1 to year 5, you're still covered on a certain amount of recovery value from year 5 to year 10, and still from year 10 to year 12. So you're able to determine future price points and future recovery values by learning from the auction process. Now, while you don't see everything, you'll certainly cover 70 to 80% of construction machinery during an auction lifespan. And I definitely think that, you get to understand not just the sales environment, but where a machine is bought from. Iraq love to purchase certain brands of Chinese equipment because they like the brand. Saudi Arabian contractors like to buy certain equipment because they like the brand, but not other brands. In India, aerial work platforms like JLG, Genie, and other types of assets in the lifting space will be sold extremely quickly into India because they prefer buying second-hand equipment than they do new equipment because of the tax. So you learn all these things as you evolve. So for the individual, for the question, yeah, it's a great learning curve. You don't see everything, but you see a lot. Definitely worth considering, someday.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions? Right, we no longer have questions. So what is remaining is to thank everybody for joining. And thanks, Gary Reagan, for being with us on this. I think this is not the end, but we are going to continue inviting you so that you continue educating us on the asset-based finance and equipment financing and leasing as well. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Basim, for being our interpreter today. Now our webinar ends now. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Ruka. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.
Thank you.